Hello, my name is Lowell, pronouns he, him, and this is another one of our Open Hearth gaming community talking sessions. We've done a number of these community chats about particular genres or about particular topics. We've covered mystery games, we've covered supers, we've covered horror, and I asked earlier this week some people about what kind of topics they wanted to do. And I was surprised that the sci-fi space opera one came on as one of the high picks. I wasn't expecting that. And for me, it kind of comes out of the fact that for the last, I'd say, year, I've been running Star Trek a lot and enjoying that, and prior to that, a lot of Dune and some other things. And then Alan had a spate of we played Starforge and we played his game, The Cluster. And so a lot more sci-fi than I had done previously. So for me, I was very interested in putting that on the list to have things that we could talk about. And I called it Talking Space Opera because I kind of wanted to have it the biggest tent possible in some ways. I do think there are some genres that overlap, but I think we can kind of exclude from this. For example, I mentioned in the sort of working document, I think that there's cyberpunk is, outside of this, that we do have some games that are space opera that have, cyberpunk supplements or settings and things like that. And I think that mecha games are often outside of that. And I don't know how to describe like the what the expanse is, like the in solar system kind of narrow approach to things, a very kind of hard sci-fi, but also, in system. So for me, and this may be disagreeable, I do think for me, space opera is we've got multiple star systems, like we're traveling from system to system. We've got ships. Maybe we're not necessarily doing the space combat, but I like space combat. But we've got multiple systems. We're traveling around. There are aliens or remnants of aliens, or our aliens are ourselves because, we're so far in the future that it's different species of humanity or whatnot. That is it a little bit for me. And to quote the Wikipedia that Rich put in the notes, Wikipedia says space opera is a subgenre of science fiction that emphasizes outer space adventures set in a universe which faster than light travel has become common. Plots often play out against a backdrop of space warfare, alien civilizations, and galactic empires. And I think that that's fair. I think that all of those things are fair. And I do think that as opposed to certain kinds of hard sci-fi, space opera is about characters. Like the characters really are front and center in a way. Sometimes we talk about this as being a difference between OSR and some other games. OSR being a game where, your characters die and we slot another character in kind of thing. Whereas other games where we're building around the characters as the focal point of the story. Though I do want to mention, I say hard sci-fi kind of outside of that. Brandon mentioned in the notes to Alistair Reynolds doing hard sci-fi in a kind of space opera vein. And it's my understanding that Adrian Tchaikovsky is a little more in that vein as well, though this is not a genre that I have read deeply in since like C.J. Shera and stuff. So I'm very like back to the 80s at that point. One of the other questions is where the borderline is between space opera and science fantasy. And like a lot of stuff can get described as science fantasy. For me, science fantasy is when we've actually got wizards. Oh, we've actually got a wizard in there that is literally a wizard. At that point, we're science fantasy, because people sometimes describe Star Wars as science fantasy, but I don't think the Jedi are wizards. So that's just my opinion. That I know they're psychics, but it also means that I do include Star Trek as space opera rather than hard sci-fi, because if you watch the first couple of seasons of Star Trek, we've got all these people with weird psychic powers and gods and all of these things. And so that's very much in there. So I want to talk about my experience with sci-fi games and space opera just briefly. And then I want to maybe get some input about some topical things. So the earliest, I think, sci-fi games really are space opera or lean into space opera. Traveler is one of the earliest, and while it does have a real hard sci-fi bent, it does lean into a lot of those tropes. It can be very much played that way, and I think that depending on your take on it, they can be, you know, however much you want to play it one direction or the other. But literally, space opera from Fantasy Games Unlimited is one of the earliest sci-fi games. But then we also have Universe. We have the original Star Trek D6, and we have Star Trek from VASA, and then we have Star Wars D6. There are other games I think that I have played that have done space opera well. I do think Dune does it, and we'll come back to that in terms of the ideas of space opera and licensed games. I think that Space Wyrm versus Moonicorn, if you haven't played that, the lighter version of that is a dynamite space opera game. I think it's really wondrous, a super fun play in the long term. And I think that the base concepts, not the actual games, I think the base concepts of Ashen Stars, where you've got troubleshooters going across different star systems and a bunch of different alien peoples. I think Fading Suns and Coriolis, those are all really great ideas for space opera. Maybe the execution is a little bit less. So I do want to say when I did these notes and when I first posted this, I did tag Rich into this because if there's anyone in the community who has played run slash more sci-fi than anyone else, I think it arguably could be Rich. And Rich is the one who provided the Wikipedia link. So, Rich, do you have thoughts when we say space opera? What does that mean to you? And how does that fit with your conception of what Star Wars is about?
When you say space opera, my first thought is always Star Wars. That's the first time I'd heard the term space opera being science fiction with a grand scope. I think like the first image I think of is Emperor Palpatine's arrival on the Death Star when you pull back and you see this hangar that is obscenely big. And there are thousands of troops just to see this one man. And all of the space battles are just a cacophony of visuals and a thrilling swashbuckling action. Space opera to me is that science fantasy. So I always think of Star Wars first, but you've given a large number of examples that I almost all agree with. And so I accept your premise for those ideas.
Excellent. I appreciate that. It's always good to have that input there. Anyone else have additional thoughts about how we might describe space opera that maybe you want to add into or things that you want to point to? And feel free to raise your hand. Brandon.
Yeah, I think you hit it pretty much on the head in your first go, in that the space opera not only focuses on the characters, but it focuses on the characters to a certain degree as individual actors, as generators of storyline, as opposed to I'm in this military organization, and I am working within it, and I have my own story, or I'm operating under the rules and regulations of this structure that I'm in. They're almost always actors that are causing new action, that are breaking the structure to some degree, and the genre allows them to do that. And Star Wars is the archetype for this. Really, where it's like, okay, these characters, even though they're just individuals, they are causing dynamic action because they happen to be in the right place at the right time, or to have knowledge that nobody else has, or or simply to be the linchpin, in some other forces that are coming together, but they're still very much acting on their own individual basis.
Our characters matter. Interesting, interesting. Alan.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when Rich put up on the document his Wikipedia entry on space opera, which set me thinking about the characteristics of space opera. Is it similar to soap opera and horse opera and all those other generic forms? Recurring cast, recurring supporting cast, recurring factions, recurring key locations. In the UK we had something called Emergency Ward 10, which was our first hospital drama. Again, soap operas, melodrama, all that stuff. There's something of that in space opera for me.
This point's actually an interesting thing. And Ray, would it be okay if I ask you a question here?
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, so when you went to write the amazing game Once More Into the Void, I'm gonna push people's games today too. I'm gonna do that for Alan
Thank
as
you.
well. Like, how much of that, like, were you thinking about Star Wars or Star Trek or the ideas of space opera when you went to approach that?
Yeah, with Once More Into the Void, I was literally watching an episode of Picard, and it was a scene where he was trying to recruit someone onto the team, and I saw it playing back and forth, and I started seeing what they were saying as mechanics, and that became the game, basically, the recruitment phase, and which made me also think of Mass Effect 2 in particular, and really drawing, I think, like really going like deep, like neck deep into the emotionality, the character basing. But also, I feel like in space opera, what tends to come up, especially for people and their melodrama, is that this is a melodrama that draws other people in, that lasts for generations, that has consequence. There are redemption arcs. So they're relationships, but they're like really larger than life and have several perspectives, none of which is like the sole correct one, which I also feel about Star Wars, right? There's a lot of like Kurosawa Rashomon going on in Star Wars. And so I feel that space opera in that sense, right? That specific character focus, because there's a lot that I agree with what people are saying in terms of the spaceship battles and the epicness. But in that case, that's what I was focusing on for Once More Into the Void in particular, the huge, heavy. I tried to make the game feel like it was inescapable to not get entangled, basically, with your past and your hope for the future.
Interesting. You point to Mass Effect, and I think Halo, Mass Effect, and more recently, Starfield, Outer Worlds, these are all games that have really leaned into space opera in a really interesting way and developed that. It kind of points to one of the reasons, like, I love the idea of No Man's Sky. I think No Man's Sky is a beautiful game. I think it's a super fun activity, but it also feels like a very lonely game. I know that you can kind of interact with other characters, and there are NPCs, but you kind of don't matter. Like I mean, unless you're going to spend hundreds of hours and really dig into the main line, you can feel like you're just a dot moving within that particular universe. And on that note, and on this, I think we have in the notes here the question of whether 40K is space opera. And I've waffle on this because it looks like space opera, like it looks big thing, but your characters don't matter. Like I don't care how cool your characters are kind of in the game. They can't really change things. Andish?
Yeah, I think that is part of it. And also, and this is, I'm not super in on 40K, but from what I understand, in the like current, where we're describing current events, nothing happens. Like, sure, they blow up a planet or whatever, but the overall situation doesn't change. And for me, at least, I think that's an important part of space opera. There has to be like important over like changes to the situation, because otherwise it's just it's military sci-fi, definitely, but if there are no, like, the fall of the empire or whatever, or like in Dune, where you have the rise of Paul Atreides and all of that, if you don't have those sort of I can't find the word, but big changes to
Right.
the situation, it doesn't feel like space opera to me, at least. But I'm not sure. Maybe
Yeah.
that's
It
a
is
limit on my
interesting.
thinking.
in it as a setting and as a miniatures game, it has to remain that consistent. But when we look at like Rogue Trader, the video game, or Space Marine 2, like that's where it really does lean into melodrama and tries to make those characters matter because for that particular medium, you have to do that to make it feel inviting and interesting. So yeah, I don't know if it is setting or story. I don't know how we would if space opera is one or the other or both. But I want to start with kind of shift to a topic here, and I want to talk about space and space travel and that idea and multiple systems and things like that. One of the things is for me, that often feels like a really important part. We've got our spaceships. We can move from system to system. We often have time that we can spend on the spaceships in these stories. The ships become a character. We can spend money and buy spaceship floor plans and then never use them because they look really cool, but then we don't actually get to playing them out unless we're playing Traveler or, a snapshot, on a little board. But then I say that, but then there's Dune. And Dune, like space travel, happens. It is a thing that occurs, and we go from system to system, but the actual transit and the being in space and all of that stuff is not a factor. It's not a big thing. The guild controls that. Maybe you can go to orbit and do stuff, but like that's not a thing that you do or control. So I'm curious about people's thoughts about games that do that travel well or have interesting mechanics for ships or that have an interesting approach to space and that distance. Here I'm going to throw to Rich because there is an old PBTA move that was something that you mentioned to me years ago that still stays my thing. I think is it Rust Hulks or one of the other ones that has that like
Oh yeah.
the
That great travel move. It was so good.
Oh, yeah. Ray played in the Rust Hulks game I ran in Star Wars, and while I accept that maybe Rust Hulks as built is not space opera, it's similar to The Expanse. Like Expanse is a huge influence for it. It can do space opera, tramp freighter style stories extremely well. I think that Rust Hulks is probably the top. I was looking over, I've played over 100 different RPGs set in Star Wars, and I tried to figure out which of these, I looked over the list, which of these evoke space opera with their mechanics? There aren't many. There aren't many at all. But Rust Hulks to me can do space opera with its mechanics extremely well. Oddly enough, Fellowship has a travel move that I really enjoy. And when I ran it for it's set in Star Wars, it fit like a glove. It was my favorite port over travel maneuver that wasn't supposed to be for space opera or even a sci-fi. Well, you could argue Fellowship is sci-fi, but doesn't matter. Fellowship's travel mechanics work very well in space opera, in my opinion, because they evoke story. They force collaboration.
Can you give us like the elevator pitch on those two, the Rust Hulks and the Fellowship?
I'm going to be a little fuzzy on Rust Hulks, so Ray will help me. But Rust Hulks is you're going to wager a certain amount of your fuel, and so there's a risk reward. Exactly, and then it comes to a die roll, so it could all go wrong. You could try to play it cheap, and you know that things are going to be rough. You can try to overcompensate because you're at an early part of your trip, and then it could still suck and bad things happen. So it's really dangerous. It feels, I know this isn't necessarily space opera, but it feels very Aliens to me, the Aliens genre, those tramp freighters out in the void. There are moments of Expanse that had that as well. So that's my memory of Rust Hulks. It's been 4+ years since I actually ran it. Fellowship is fresher to my mind. That is hey, let's pass the stick around for an obstacle and then how you overcome it. And then the GM can add in stuff and at the end tie stuff together. So it's a really fun it's a fun way to let everyone contribute to the story and bring in elements of space opera that they're most excited about. And you do it in a way where, yes, it's a challenge, but it's swashbuckling in that, yeah, you continue forward. You didn't necessarily fail. You got to the place or near the place you wanted to get to. And that's what made Fellowship really fun for me.
I want to ask you a question to follow up on that, and then I want to throw to Alan to talk about how he adapted some of these things for the cluster. Is Rust Hulks, or is it a different game that has the when you travel, your characters have chains with each other and there's anchors?
Yes, yes, yes. That is exactly the one. Rust Hulk's chains and their relationships, they're choking, they can be slack, and those chains will change over time. They're very dynamic. And what's great is that they can be you can have two characters who are inextricably linked. They could be in love or they could be hateful towards each other. And mechanically, they are effectively the same. And then they shift and dynamically change over time. And then the experience point system is built to reward people who are moving those relationships around.
Cool. Another game I'll point to that I think has a really interesting system for this is Impulse Drive, another PBTA game. I think that I really want to see a second edition of Impulse Drive. It's one of the games at the top of my list for I would like them to go back and revisit it. But it has a wonderful thing about it's a little bit about your travel, but it's mostly when you land at a planet, then you've got to do through this process of, do you have enough money? There's a little bit of a get a gig, what comes out of that I think is really fascinating for what it emphasizes, like that landing and getting a job, a little bit like the sprawl is really important. Alan, can I ask you about the cluster?
Yeah, by all means. The cluster came out of Starforged. I like the idea of Starforged where you roll some dice to get from A to B, and how well you roll the dice tells you what happens on the journey or what the cost might be. Starforged didn't quite do it for me as a whole game, but that's where when I think the cluster's trigger is when you set a course for a new in-system destination, blah. So and that is similar. That is like Fly a Span. What I wanted to do though is to separate the economics from the encounter. So I wanted that to generate a random encounter, rather more like Starforged. But the Starforged tables are just too much for me to absorb. And in terms of the connection back to Rust Hulks, I really like the idea. In Rust Hulks, when you're rolling a character, you get a little box that tells you which bit of the ship you can personalize. For me, there wasn't a kind of direct impact of those modifications on play on a regular basis. So what I do is there's a ship playbook with a set of there's control there's operations, there's engineering, there's hull, and there's quarters, and within those you've got a series of no more than 3 or 4 subsystems, each of which has a move attached to it, and you make some decisions when you're rolling up a character about which of those systems you'll boost. So there's a soldier background in the book which gives you an opportunity to boost weapons or structure armor. So in making a choice of character, you are kind of making a choice about the kind of ship you want. That's the principle anyway. And yeah, because I think it's important the ship is a character in the game. I think it needs to have some legs.
David, you mentioned Starscape in the chat there. I did back it, but I haven't read it because I don't read things till the final version comes. I'm so dumb about this. But like what does Starscape do for travel and space and so on? You said you played a little bit of that.
Yeah, I've only played one session and it was a while ago, so I probably am not really good on the particulars, but it was a playtest run by the designer. And if she was basically taking Farscape and emulating that. And so like some of the things that we talked about, like, landing on a planet, trying to figure out what to do, some of that was there, but the found family and setting up sort of the working together, but the inner conflicts and so forth The drama was pretty heavy, as I recall. So I really feel like it's in that space of space opera, but I can't speak to like how the rules reinforce
Mhm.
that, long term at this point until I get my copy as well.
Yeah, yeah.
But
That's
it
from
was it was
yeah.
it was a fun session, anyways.
That's from Kimmy Hughes and
Yep.
Golden Lasso Games. It's interesting you mentioned Farscape. I'm surprised we got this far without one of us mentioning Starscape, because if there is a game that is episodic space opera, I think that Farscape really, really hits all of those buttons for me. Another interesting thing to think about in a sort of the mechanical side of things is the form that space travel takes, because we have in a lot of these games the Star Wars style, we jump to warp and then we're waiting for a while. We're traveling, we're in a space where nothing is going to happen, but we got time where the characters can interact and do things. Then we have games where you're traveling along and maybe you'll encounter something. Certainly, Starforged has that, like, oh, on your travel, you might spot something and have to kind of stop. And then you have, and I personally love this just because it creates a weird hard point. I love the idea of the jump gates. I love what having a fixed point that has codes or has to be controlled, what that does to the structure of play. But it is one that kind of takes out a little bit of the when we travel, there's some downtime. So instead, the travel time is we got to go to the transit gate and then we got to go from the transit gate to the place. So it kind of steals a little bit of that vibe there. Alan?
The best of all possible worlds, a journey to the ring gate, and then a fortnight locked up in the tin can with the rest of the crew till you come out the other end.
So, well, you're British, so queuing is in your blood. So, right?
Indeed. Yeah, no, we would have to install that kind of delay in any ring gate that we develop.
So let me ask you this then. This is a logical jump off from here. And I think this is one of the things that I find the most challenging is, okay, we've got spaceships. How big narratively and mechanically is space combat? Like, I think that this is one of the big things. How do we manage that? I personally love the idea of big capital ships fighting. I love that. I loved old Battlefleet Gothic and, Space Fleet, and I played a ton of Starfleet battles back in the day quite badly. But I kind of love that. I'm maybe less interested in the dogfighting stuff, but like that's also still cool. And certainly Tachyon Squadron, does that really well for me. Rich, for you, how much has spaceship combat, dogfight, or ship to ship combat been a part of the Star Wars games that you've run?
The third game that I ran in Star Wars Saturdays is called The Rebel Few. It was a hack by the original designers of The Few, which is a game about RAF pilots in World War II. They reskinned it for Rebel pilots, and I ran that on Roll20, and it was about as tactical dogfighting game as I've ever run. I don't know how well I ran it, but I did my best. And so I always have a soft spot in my heart for that. I think it's a really cool design because there are narrative choices along with tactical choices in Rebel Few. I glad you said Tachyon Squadron because that was another one that I ran and really really liked. I also think that Star Furies, which is a hack of Agon, the second edition of Agon,
Mm.
is quite good for some rollicking space combat, a lot of dogfighting actions and capabilities there because people are incentivized, players are incentivized to not just win, but also top their other pilots. And that can get really exciting in a competitive way from time to time. Not everyone likes competition in RPGs, but it can be fun. Starfighter is another Starfighter sim RPG, a little heavier on the sim than I love. But I've run, to answer the question, I probably 2 to 3 times a year will pop in to run a game that has a pretty significant amount of star fighting fights going on.
Mhm.
It's not a focus for Star Wars Saturdays. It's usually character drama, but it can be really fun to have folks just throw on a helmet, jump into a starfighter, and go do wild action stuff. And I think it makes it stand out from all the other go do action stuff to me.
Mhm.
There's something about the void of space and that just unrelenting threat of sure hope I stay in this cockpit that is unique to me in most of the combat related aspects of TTRPGs.
I want to ask Mike and Ethan, both of you have mentioned things in the chat that I want to hit to. The idea when we got bigger ship combats versus the fighters of giving all the players something to do. And well, I've got a couple games I could talk about with it. But Ethan, I haven't really looked hard at what Stars Without Number does for space combat.
So I've never run it. I've just played it. And it's been a while, so I may get something wrong here. But basically each player takes a role, and it's a mechanical role. It's that contributes to it. And I think there are other games that do this with for different situations where like each you're working as a team and each person has like a job and they roll to see how that job turns out. I think that Stars Without Number does that just particularly well. It's like each role is consequential. It's not just sort of contributing to the I don't know.
No.
I wish I had the book in front of me right now so I could remember what the consequences were and what the results were of each person's role. I just remember it like every member of the group like had something to do and could contribute or screw up the fight in a way that like one person wasn't going to get everyone killed with one roll, but it did feel like they did have some influence over it. It had a nice balance between like it wasn't too forgiving. Like some games it's nice that you're not accidentally going to kill everyone, right. But you don't want it to be so forgiving that your role doesn't matter. And I just think that Stars Without Number has a really nice balance for that in space combat.
It's interesting because there is a similar system to that in Ashen Stars, a Gumshoe game, and with all due respect to that game, I don't think it's very good because you've got these different positions, but it's really they're all burning down kind of a single thing, and it ends up everything feels very vanilla in that. Mike, you had mentioned about the idea of games that have different positions and different things that those do.
Yeah, one of the challenges that I've seen, I think that the system that I have most familiarity with around Starship combat is Starfinder, which is a fairly crunchy system. It comes out of the Pathfinder kind of realm. And one of the challenges that I see with that is space combat should feel fast and frantic and furious, and when you get into those very crunchy systems, they tend to have these very draconic structured kind of rounds where they say, okay, this is when the pilot does their role and they describe what they do and pick a move and do a thing, and then now it's the engineering phase, and so you kind of end up sitting around the table waiting for your turn to come up for your 5 seconds of awesome, and then somebody else gets to have a go. Or you sort of, I'm the engineer and I route all the power to the weapons, and then the weapons guy fires and misses, and so it's kind of, it's very easy to have very boring kind of 30-minute blocks. One of the things I really liked, I played in a one-shot of Superbandit, which I mentioned in the chat. And one of the things I really liked about that, it was like a simultaneous roll. So it had a very simple sort of rock, paper, scissors thing. And because it was a space skirmish, it was kind of Top Gun in space. You would kind of pair off against one of the enemy fighters, one or two of the enemy fighters, pick sort of your one of the rock, paper, scissors thing to do while the GM did the same. And then they would all be revealed at once, and then everybody would make a roll, and all of that would be resolved, and then you would move on to the next round if there were enemy fighters left. So it felt fast and frantic and furious, and it felt like when there was moments of downtime, that was like, okay, now is when I get to breathe before I have to make the next difficult decision.
I will speak to what I think is a better, more robust station-based combat that we've seen recently. I ran Star Trek Adventures First Edition, and I've run Star Trek Adventures Second Edition. And the one of the big changes between the editions is they got rid of a whole set of dice mechanics of effect dice are gone. Just that whole thing, which was a whole like second step of resolution and calculating and things like that. And that has simplified Star Trek Adventures. And they are very explicit. We've got a bunch of different roles when you do ship to ship combat. So we've got the command position, we've got, tactical weapons, we've got the con, we've got engineering, all of those things. And they have both a set of generic actions that you can do, like to create a trait, or to jump to another station and things. But they've also got some very specific for their roles, interesting choices. And you can do a more flavorful thing. You can technobabble and make a roll, and that will cause an impact that other people can use. And you can also do roles to affect the economy. You can generate momentum for other people, or you can do things that directly affect. Like the person who has the piloting thing has some choices about how your ship is flying, whether you're flying for an attack pattern or not, and that's going to affect some other people. There's a lot of interactivity between those positions. And also it's because as an economy, it's I go, character goes, and then the bad guy ship goes, and then we keep alternating. But you can make a decision. The captain can go, oh, I'm going to spend momentum to go before they get their next action. So there are a lot of really interesting tactical choices. And like I can get a spaceship fight done in an hour block, and it feel like a significant thing, and have time for RP. Like we can have people describe what they're doing, and I can do the explosions and all of that kind of thing, and it feels really good. I think that's a game that has done that really well. Any other games that people want to mention that do spaceship combat well? I remember Last Fleet has some really interesting stuff for resolving those dogfights, because that fight and the attrition and the wearing down of the fleet is really important.
Oh, wait, before you move past, I
Yeah.
have to say Last Fleet has one of my favorite out of the box, like cinematic moves, which is there's a move for waiting patiently for the people who are out there fighting. You as a player can have your character contribute. And there's just something so lovely about that, because you get a part in that. You get to cheer for them and mechanically influence things. I love that. Waiting patiently or just watching through the view screen and being nervous, and your character actually cares about who wins this, and then there's a roll. So it's great. I love that thing.
Awesome. I love when everybody gets a part. Mike also mentioned taking a break at the table and going and playing X-Wing for these things, which is actually something I literally did with the Crimson Skies game, where we actually had maps and planes and stuff. We used Fate to do it, and it was super fun. The little marker things. So aliens. How important are aliens in these games? Whether they're aliens that you can interact with, whether they're threatening, whether they're Mass Effect, we can have sex with them aliens. We've got a lot of different kinds of aliens in these games. Neil.
I do like a variety of aliens, and when it came to sci-fi series, I almost kind of bounced off Battlestar Galactica because there were no aliens. The question that I want to pose to the group, does anybody remember the RPG that had a literal table of foreheads that you could roll? I assume it was meant to be obviously a Star Trek spoof, and I can't remember the name of the game.
No, I don't remember that. It certainly is a long running gag.
It was a literal visual table of foreheads that you could roll against, and I was like, I get such a spoof on Star Trek.
I think one of the things that really, for me, it was space opera. I want aliens, but I want them to be interesting, and I want them to not feel clutched together. And again, here I'm about to dump on Ashen Stars again. The alien species in there feel like, oh, we had to make up some alien species. Here you go. Like there's something about them that doesn't cohere or grab for me. Rich, again, Star Wars, aliens, a little less of the forehead of the week for them. How important, how interactive, how much do the nature of the aliens matter for you for Star Wars as space opera?
I think it's huge. I think of the cantina scene and the delight of all the used costume shop stuff that comes out, and then Tales from the Cantina books, like whole stories about these weird aliens. I don't also like it's space opera. Maybe the aliens don't have to just be humans, but in a different suit. They can have a common language. They can speak their language, but we understand it. There's just something really fun and cosmopolitan about that in space opera. I'm with Neil. If there aren't any aliens, it doesn't feel operatic as much to me. I mean, even Babylon 5 wouldn't be the same kind of story if there weren't problems with alien races. And also, again, we get into the Star Trek Babylon 5 of the aliens often compare themselves to humanity and give us a different perspective on our existence as meat sacks walking around this one planet. So I love having aliens. That said, in a recent game in the Topani sector, which is mostly humans, I said, let's try to make aliens unique and special. Not everyone in this group should be a weird alien. That's the only problem I have is in space opera, if no one plays the token human, it feels kind of weird because then you don't have a touchstone, you don't have a base metric, you don't have a groups who can just be the regular, so the weirdos can be weird.
I like that. Other takes on aliens. I'll point to an interesting game that I had to do some reading on recently, Fragged Empire, the second edition of that, which is like there aren't really aliens, but there are because all the aliens are genetically created species by the precursor, humans before Earth fell, and those evolved into different species, and so they all come from a place or are all the result of that. And actually, I think despite the crunch of Fragged Empire, I think it's got a really interesting setting and some really interesting species there with very different, interesting cultural heritages. Other people want to throw in on aliens? Alan?
Yeah, now I'm wishing I'd included them. I think there's something about the scale. I think, what are aliens for? Are they there for part of the awe and wonder you're trying to create, in which case you want them in? Are they, or are they just? I think Rich is right. It's how do you make aliens more than people with funny foreheads, and that I think is more of a challenge. Because each cluster is created by the group of players, it would have required me to put a lot more thought into that if we were going to create an alien species to be somewhere about. So that was beyond the step I wanted to take. But no, I can see them as part of the awe and wonder of the universe.
And I think I'll point to something that Ray has mentioned in the chat that I think is really important, something I've been thinking about is how much we talk about fantasy bioessentialism, how much with these various space games where they have aliens, they are bioessentialist. Essentially, if you get an alien, they are this cultural heritage, they are this kind of thing. And that really bugs me. There's been some recent Star Trek stuff that leans into if you're this species, this is what you do. Cultural heritage doesn't matter. This is how you are. And that really, really bugs me. And I think it is very easy for people to do that because it's shorthand, especially if you've got like, oh, I've got a dozen alien species. How am I going to characterize them? I think that's a real easy trap to fall into. Like, I do think that you need to consider how you present the culture of them, how you make that interesting, how you make that not just something that, okay, because they're genetically predisposed to this. We've got some reasons why they have done this. And then we see that there are differences in the cultural flavor and feeling of something. It's one of the things I think it's an advantage of Star Trek over time when it's done well is we've seen very different Bajorans. We've seen very different Klingons. We've seen very different Trill. That these species, the best presentations of them is where we get people that have been raised differently, have had different cultural experiences, and we get to see them played out in that way. It's also a question of how much do we want the aliens as the backdrop versus how much we want the aliens as player species in the game. I think that is a big question as well. Oddish points to Babylon 5 as a very interesting, very solid. I think, yeah, I agree with you that Babylon 5 does a really interesting job where each of those peoples, each of those cultures, each of the species gets time to be on stage and gets time to show us what their culture is like. And then we get to see the interactions and the clashes of those once that have been really well established. Anything else people want to say about aliens? Andish?
I think if we go to Star Trek, what can be an issue there is that the aliens are used to illustrate an idea. They're not people. They're manifestations of an aspect of humanity or something like that, which makes them by default and necessity very homogeneous, unless the point is that they're not homogeneous. But they because the point of the show or many of those episodes is that we have a concept. The crew encounters this concept and they deal with it in some way, and the concept is illustrated with an alien species.
I think that's fair, and certainly runs into the question of stereotyping, of presenting them in one way, of putting different species to margins, and having them stand as analogs for real world things, which is also a challenging thing. Mike Minutulu mentions Enemy Mine as a classic of the sort of aliens genre. So let me ask this. This is something we've established before. We said that characters matter in space opera. How in a universe that is that big, what are ways in which we as the GM can make the characters matter? I'm curious about people's thoughts on that as players, if there's been moves that the GM has done, or are there systems that make that feel like that matters, or GM's things that you've done that make the characters not just alone in the black void of space. Andish.
If we're going to back to what we talked about at the beginning, I think being part of important events. I don't think that's necessary for an RPG, but I think it is one way to make it feel more like space opera.
I think you illustrated this really well in one of the Dune games you ran, Lo, where the characters were basically important functionaries in a house that had just been sort of handed a planet with the expectation probably that they were going to fail at administrating it. But the kind of the situation that the house was in meant that what the characters did was critically important because the fate of the house was coming so close to the line of demarcation of, even small successes, would put it on the trajectory to succeed rather than to fail. It felt that what we were doing was very much setting an example for something bigger, turning, each doing our little part to turn the ocean liner so that it misses the iceberg.
For me, from a Star Wars vein, sorry, Lowell, look like
I was gonna throw to you. So good.
For me, from a Star Wars vein, one of the standing rules I've had for Star Wars Saturdays is this is the story of the characters. So the canon characters of Star Wars are only ever mentioned in passing, if at all. We have had Admiral Akbar. That is because a player created one of the children of Akbar. So, okay, I guess Admiral Akbar is now involved in this thing. He gave a speech. It was not a trap. And I couldn't help myself and had the PCs in the Bounty of the Week game go head up against Dengar, who they killed, And that taught me a lesson because now Dengar is dead in Star Wars Saturday's canon. And I'm like, hey, if the characters matter, they get to make their own canon. They get to, like, if you want to stick this Star Wars character in the thing, they are at risk. So it's either side. Like, the characters matter because they get to shape the narrative. They get to tell the story. They get to affect the event. So for me, in Star Wars, the things that I present are canon planets, major canon events, but the little ticky-tacky bits within are things that characters can affect and shape and evolve in their own way based on the story that we tell.
I like that. There is the idea that characters matter because they can change the game state. They can make choices that lead to changes that stay around. Other people's thoughts on that? Alan, and then Mike.
I think that the more you can make setting creation collaborative, the better. You know, Starforged is a kind of lesson in those truths that you collectively have to kind of come to terms with across a whole range of stuff. And anything like that, I think, is the way to get buy-in, because then, you know, people are creating the kind of game they want to play. And those choices define whether it's fantasy or hard sci-fi or whatever else. So the more you can build the players into that, the better. It's a challenge in, you know, rich canon universes. But as Rich has pointed out, you know, it's not about the 1,000 worlds, it's about this one and this bit of that one, and how we are going to interact with that bit of that one. So yeah, I think that the more you can help players get involved in it, the better. How you do that, I think, can be a challenge, because, you know, there's particularly in the open hearth where everyone wants somebody else to make the choice. You know, oh no, I'll make the last choice because we're so polite to one another.
Right.
But yeah, it generally speaking, I think collective creation is the best creation.
Mike?
Yeah, I think the advice I was going to give probably applies not just to space opera, but to RPGs in general, which is to deploy the butterfly effect as a facilitator. If people aren't making huge, important, galaxy-defining decisions, take all the small decisions they're making and have them explode out somewhere. They found a cool nebula and didn't do anything with it. Okay, well then when they get to the next spaceport, somebody else hears about it and sets up a mining operation, which then becomes a pirate base, and that leads back to whatever the player's choice was in that moment.
I like that. Ray, you mentioned in the chat one of your favorite tricks. Do you want to speak to that?
Oh yeah. So I feel like it can apply to any game. But in mind with space opera, in mind with NPCs and such. So my favorite trick is using establishing questions plus triangle relationships. So establishing questions is a way to draw in a PC. And so I like when I introduce an NPC, instead of having this long, like trying to get to know them, trying to, you know, just release things bit by bit. I like to ask someone. So if I had Dengar show up, hopefully he won't die, but if Dengar showed up, I'd ask, why does Dengar trust you, even though you betrayed him the last time you fought together, right? So I like to ask those kind of questions. And if it was going to be the space opera slant, I'd probably push more towards factions. I'd push more towards events, right? Like, how did you help Dengar shake off the bounty on him? And why did the mercenary group pull you in? So on and so forth. And some people like to have establishing questions that are more broad and open. I like to have them more specific. I think it depends on your group and players and what they respond to. And then the next part is I like to have triangle relationships, which I first came across in Masks, where the same NPC should have two different relationships with two different PCs.
Mm-hmm.
So one person is best friends with Dengar, and the other person is like maybe a mentor or maybe a student, maybe a rival, right? And so the two PCs will have very different opinions on the same NPC, and the same NPC will treat them very differently. So you get to have more of a spectrum where an NPC won't just like feel one note because they have those two very different relationships.
T says in the chat, co-generating setting things also helps avoid the quote, only one some of the people at the table had a deep knowledge of lore, and that creates a power imbalance, which I think is really true. One of the things that Rich and I have talked about and struggled with is the idea of how much setting knowledge someone needs to have, can have, how important that is to what we're playing in. And I come from it from the Star Trek side. Rich comes from the Star Wars side. And it is interesting to watch Rich, who has confidence with the Star Wars side, when he comes and plays in Star Trek. He's like, I don't know, I don't want to be captain. Very worried about the level of his knowledge, and it's about the GM. I think again, it leans into the collaborative to make that the things that the players say will fit into the context of the universe that you're doing. Am I mischaracterizing you, Rich?
Not at all.
Okay.
It was a great experience to come into your house of Star Trek, which some might argue isn't really space opera. Come into your house and have your knowledge and me continually effing up and referencing things that don't exist in that particular timeline. And realizing, oh yeah, this could be intimidating. This is a thing I need to make sure that I care for. You did nothing wrong.
Oh, no.
You did a great job of being welcoming and accepting and gently correcting when I was in the wrong timeline, mind space, et cetera, et cetera.
I think the only correction I did was we're in the original series and Rich wanted holodeck stuff.
I did. I wanted holodecks. It's the first thing I thought of. Star Trek holodecks. Holodecks, Star Trek.
Because holodecks are very cool. Yeah.
I messed it up. And that's it. That's the only time where you said, yeah, Rich, come on. And then other players were also like, yeah, Rich, come on this thing or that thing. It's been a great experience, but it is educational to me because I'm used to running Star Wars and just going and assuming that there is at least a base level of knowledge. And that's not fair to people who are just intrigued by the thing and want to try it without feeling like they have to measure their lore against a particular stick of, yeah, must be this tall to ride this ride. Mm-hmm. That is not cool.
Alan,
before we leave the collaborative setting and characters being able to have an impact on the setting, you have to talk about factions, because you need to have factions in the game. It needs to be a manageable number, otherwise it's overwhelming. And they need to be sufficiently framed to be useful to the GM, but at the same time, sufficiently flexible to respond to why that character created that faction.
Factions are interesting too, because factions are things that can go across star systems. They can go across planets, so they are definite callback things. It's one of the things I appreciate about the cluster and Starforge, and that is that faction building is in there. Andish, and I can't remember what you did for your Blades in the Dark Star Wars hack, what the name of it was. Can you remind me?
Stars in the Dark?
Stars in the Dark. How much factions play a role in how you built that?
A huge role. Factions were the game, kind of. Mm-hmm. But I think that goes back to Blades in the Dark, because Blades in the Dark without factions is just, yeah, I guess we're stealing stuff. I mean, it's not interesting if you don't have the factions. And admittedly, I maybe went a little overboard, because I think I have more factions in that than there are in the original Blades. I have dozens of factions. But I like that sort of thing, and it comes easily to me, I guess, to make up different groups and that sort of thing. But Rich would have to speak to how it worked in play, because for me it was great, because I just knew what everything was, and I'm not sure the players did. There were a lot of factions that never came into play, but I knew they were there, and I could bring them in if I needed them. So
I'll speak to it since you name-checked me. The factions were incredibly evocative. They were interesting. Just the little blurb, 1 or 2 sentence blurb you had for each of them immediately gave me ideas of, okay, well, I can do this to that group, and these guys will be okay if I go head up on these folks. And it was very rich, and not me, but rich as in fulsome of idea and I loved it. It was the game. Like it picked up and ran with, why are we doing this thing? How does the world react to our not great deeds? And who's going to come after us?
Yeah, and to be clear, those one or two sentences, that was all that existed until you started interacting with them. And often I didn't have an idea beyond those, that short description. So there was less to them than there is in Blades, where you have a lot of like established relationships and that sort of thing. That's part of the lore, so to speak. But I let that. I sometimes I had ideas that, oh, obviously these people will be opposed to each other, but until it was in play, it didn't really matter. But yeah, I agree that to bring this back to space opera, I think that having factions that are, I think that's important to get that sense of scale. It's not just individuals within a system. I think, at least for me, there needs to be like bigger forces, sort of thing. I think you can contrast that with Wuxia, maybe, where you also often have factions, but the conflicts are about, and now I'm talking about things that I don't know as much about, but I feel like the conflicts there are more about the individuals, and the faction stuff drives the individual conflict, whereas in space opera, it's more about the bigger conflict and the roles the individual characters play in that conflict, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, interesting. Certainly, there is a thing when I do wuxia that it starts out that way, and there's that moment where you step up the scale that suddenly we realize the individual things are in fact a big picture that I think is important there. All this talk does make me. I've been reading through the new Fischl's book. They did the proactive role playing, and they've got this collaborative campaign design book that I'm reading through. And now I kind of wonder if doing space opera with that very much, okay, let's sit down and come up with everything might be an interesting approach. I think there's a real pleasure to it. Starforged, the cluster are both like doing that session 0 from the sort of pick list are great, really fun. And Ethan mentioned Stars Without Number before. Like if you're running a space game, there is no better resource out there for just random tables of bullshit than Stars Without Number. Anything by Kevin Crawford is, in my humble opinion, pretty brilliant and useful, even if it is not the genre that you're interested in. There are going to be tools and resources there that you can use in other things. So I really, really, really do like that. Other questions, thoughts, topics you want to cover, ideas you want to throw out there? Anyone? Yes, Alan. This is where I cut the dead air when I edit. This is what happens in this section of the recording.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about this. Free from the yoke as Dune. That's you've put Fading Suns in there as your white whale. I think it could be Dune just as much.
Yeah, I love the idea of archaic space empires that are diminishing or rising. They have a little vibe of that sort of dying Earth fantasy where people have swords, maybe not forced swords, maybe real swords, and we've got lots of Game of Thrones style political interaction and things. We talked about this in the White Whales episode, but yeah, I really do want to do that. I don't think it would be that hard. Again, the question becomes how we do the sort of the spaceship starship part of it. Do we make it like in Dune, where it is not a factor, or do we make it like in Fading Suns, where that's a faction? The people who control the actual ships are like an important faction in a little bit different way than the guild navigators, because there's still people that can get ships, but gosh, I can't remember what they're called in Fading Suns. But I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there is that nice move in Free from the Yoke that you could hack into a space travel, couldn't you? Because there's that one that says when you want to take a resource from A to B, roll the dice to see how badly it goes.
Yeah, John put in the notes. This is tangential to what you said, but I think it's really interesting to point out. There's not enough Indiana Jones in space games. Uncharted Worlds does that. I think again, I can cut this if you want, Ray, but I think the brilliant Tomb Raider game, like you could do that with essentially a space civilization going and trying to rescue cultural artifacts or things that have been stolen by Imperials and so on. Like I can
Mhm.
see that as a great thing. The system is so good, and
Oh,
that could be so much fun.
yeah, no, I was thinking about that. I assure everyone Tomb Raider is being shifted into a new game. I still don't have a name for it, but so it's called not Tomb Raider right now when we talk about it in meetings. But yes, because like I've been thinking about how colonialism and imperialism is like something that shows up in space opera in a lot of ways, like especially in Star Trek, Star Wars, Mass Effect, like it's just something to acknowledge, right? Like colonization in one form or another. And the the ways in Tomb Raider when I was working on it was something that all of the adventure writers struggled with is how do we offer culture and history and people and characters and help players and the GM not stereotype them as people and not to come in as like white saviors who are going to fix everything, and how do they really work alongside people, which is also something I feel like needs to happen in space opera
Yeah.
too. I'm thinking about how the Klingons were handled in the first season of, oh, I'm blanking on the name, Star Trek.
Discovery.
I want to Discovery. Yeah, I cried for those Klingons. It was very painful watching some of those episodes.
Yeah.
I'm so glad they're better in later episodes and in Strange New Worlds. But anyway, but definitely, I do think I think there's such a rich place in terms of like unearthing older stories, ancient stories, seeing how they connect to the present and to the future. That feels like it would really make sense in the space opera
Hmm.
genre. And so, definitely, I think you could easily hack not Tomb Raider when it comes out in the
Yeah.
future. I would like to figure out how to make space combat, though. That one I keep
Yeah,
thinking about.
that'd be tough.
So,
I will say there are a couple of great resources for that kind of things. There's one of the Worlds of Fate that is just about exploring ancient sites and artifacts. Can't remember the name of it. And there's a source book for Worlds Without Number that is just about generating strange places. And of course, there's Monty Cook's book, The Weird, if you want to just generate like inexplicable locations that you have to kind of figure out what the logic is of them.
A brief mention for a game called Golgotha. It's a
Oh
little
yeah.
OSRE, and it is definitely about space dungeons, but does it from a weird aesthetic that I found quite compelling.
oh, I feel like I should also mention from Plus One XP. It's an Ashcan mode still. Through the Void. One of the. It's also like dungeon exploration. It's like ooh, I feel out of my element when I say it's new OSR or not. I'm not an expert, but it's not typical OSR. And one of the coolest techs bits of mechanics was Tony took the unseen mechanics from the between and placed them in Through the Void. So when you're exploring these dungeons and you are you're exploring and looking for things in space that definitely wants to eat you up, you get to have these little scenes where it goes into the bird's eye view. It goes back to the big station you come from, the big space station, and you get to explore these little vignettes and you really feel out the setting and everyone has to answer questions and build the setting together. I really liked how that the same mechanic from the between felt so good in Through the Void. That was like really one of the best parts of playing the game for me.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Alan?
Just a final shout out. And John, thanks for putting it in the chat. We mustn't forget Uncharted Worlds, because there's a direct line from Traveller to Uncharted Worlds in terms of that kind of big scale stuff, lots of variety. And it's also in my list of inspirations for the cluster, so I should have given Sean Gomes a plug.
And they've got a second edition of that, or they had been working on a second edition, or that's kind of.
There was a second edition floated, but I've not seen anything for several years.
Okay. Okay.
It was a very thinned down version.
Rich.
Uncharted Worlds does have cramped quarters. One of my favorite, really quick and dirty. Time has passed, and your relationship changes or evolves. So I think it's a really neat PBTA move. I like it. I move in. I drop it into pretty much every PBTA Star Wars game with space travel.
Has anyone played much of the FFG Genesis, Edge?
Oh yeah, Star Wars.
Yeah.
I love that one.
Oh, really? Oddish and then Ray?
Yeah, we played it a fair bit. I played it with my face-to-face group a bit. I didn't run it, but I played in it with a couple of the other people running games. It's fairly trad. I mean, you're counting credits and that sort of thing, which isn't my favorite way to play. And the Genesis system it's a thing. Takes a lot. I mean, it takes too long to do your dice rolls, but that's not the relevant part here. I think it does the Star Wars style of space opera fairly well, but it's hampered by being a bit too trad, I think.
Okay.
There's a bit like, I take cover and we're on the spaceship and there are only these things to do and that sort of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ray, have you played it, read it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I played a lot of. So I first got into TTRPGs with Star Wars Saga Edition, so which is like D&D pre 4th edition.
Yeah.
It's like 3.5 to 4th edition, that weird space in between. But I played the most of the Fantasy Flight, what would be the Genesis system. I have a really soft spot for it because it's still trad, but it's kind of streamlined. And it was the game that helped me understand PBTA better. Like I was playing and trying to run PBTA. And because I played D&D for so many years, I had such a hard time understanding the mixed success concept.
Right.
And in the Genesis system, with the many dice, I agree. I love the dice, but it's better when you have like an app that tells you what the result is immediately. So you don't have to sit there counting the dice and visually remembering what each one means. I absolutely agree. But it really taught me to be like, they succeeded, but something bad happens. And then they totally failed, but something good happens. And I was like a GM struggling, like, how does that make sense? But after running Star Wars so much, and it really trained me to be a better PBTA GM, basically. And I do like how the Star Wars game is very modular. You can like pick and choose the Edge of the Empire stuff, or I keep forgetting the names of the other things, but you can choose if it's more smuggler, like crime focused. You can choose if it's more rebellion focused. You can choose if it's more Jedi focused, and you can mix and match components. I really loved some of the setting books. They were like some of the best stuff to just mine and pull things. I don't think it's a game that melds perfectly together, but I think if you love Star Wars, you can. The only problem I have with that game is that the starship battles feel very clunky. Like it's very often like super hard to make that work really well. So we ended up avoiding it a lot. And also I keep killing my players with rancors. I keep thinking I can just introduce a rancor in the middle of Nar Shaddaa just for a little bit. It'll be fine. They'll run away, right? They never run away.
No.
So I've had random rancors kill 5 players by now, and I haven't learned my lesson. So I stopped running the game for now.
I think that is fair.
What Undesh and Ray said, they're much more fulsome, but I read online a quote about the Genesis system that put my brief experience, about 5-6 sessions of it. When you roll dice, the game says, interpret a glyph constellation to describe what happens.
Yeah. You need the app.
You never know if you're good at a thing.
Yeah.
That's hard for me as an RPG player.
Right.
Okay, I've got 5 blacks, 3 greens. Is that good? I just rolled a triumph and 4 threats. Did I win? Like, it's a whole lot of like, maybe.
Right. Rune casting.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I tell you what, the next time someone stumbles into an ancient artifact in the cluster, they're going to discover a constellation of glyphs.
Oh, yeah. And use it for that.
Your time here has not been wasted.
It is what kept me. I love L5R, but Genesis version of L5R, like if you thought the Star Wars dice were arcane,
Yeah.
the L5R dice
Yeah.
are even more arcane.
Weirder. And they tried
Yeah.
to streamline it, and it just made it kind of clunkier, worse
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, I agree.
Last thing I want to answer a question that was in the chat is the question of Dune, because I've run a bunch of Dune. And the question is like, how does Dune captures space opera? How does it work functionally as a system? How do you make it more? I think if you want Dune to matter, I think you don't go to Arrakis. And I think that like that doesn't matter. Like that's happening somewhere else. Whatever it is, this be your house that you've built and your planet, and there's weird shit going on there, and you've got to make it exciting and interesting, and it has consequences in its space, and those characters matter. I think if you try to do it on Arrakis, you are absolutely, yoking yourself to that story that is only really playable in the first couple of books and then it becomes no longer playable for your characters. I think you have to really go, this is just trappings of Space Empire. And then we got the Bene Gesserit and some cool shit that we're going to throw in, and it's going to be fun that way. And that stuff is happening in the background as sort of fan service. So that's my thought on Dune. I am going to quote Oddish as the last note here before we end. Oddish has put in the chat. That's the issue, I think, with making Star Wars space opera in the sense of having the big events be part of the game, in that all the important stuff is already mapped out. You have to get to a corner of time and space that's not already defined. And I think that we have seen how you and Rich and others have made those stories matter in those areas. I've never felt when I've played in any of the Star Wars games that Rich has run that it didn't matter. Like those stories matter for that place and they have bigger implications outside of it. And that's always been a pleasure. Neil?
Just as a final thought, where you can take the crazy route that I did and kill Palpatine at the end of episode 3, and then just totally fork the timeline.
Oh yeah. I think it's worth doing that, worth playing around with it. And as Rich said earlier, you killed some guy named Dengar, and Dengar was important or something. Who's Dengar?
Dengar?
Oh my gosh, who's Dengar?
Oh man, I'm so hurt. He even made it into the sequel movies, kind of.
Okay. So Dengar is important, folks. Just remember that at home. Thank you, everybody, for coming here for this Talking Space Opera chat. I really appreciate that. Just want to say goodbye. And apparently Dengar has been in a lot of Star Wars. That's the last thing I know. Justice for Dengar, apparently, here. Thank you, everybody.